During this module, we will look into service strategy. The purpose of the service strategy stage of the service lifecycle is to define the perspective, position, plans and patterns that a service provider needs to be able to execute to meet an organization's business outcomes. The perspective defines for a service provider its overall direction, values, beliefs and purpose, and at a high level how it intends to achieve these. The position defines how the service provider will be differentiated from other service providers in the industry, for example on quality or cost terms. The plan identifies how the organisation will achieve its objectives, vision and position. The pattern of action is how an organisation works. Each element that is defined within this stage of the life cycle will enable a provider to be more proactive and controlled in their service provision activities and less reactive. In essence, this life cycle stage discusses how an organisation can think and act more strategically. Service strategy is concerned primarily with two key aspects, namely, being able to define a strategy whereby a service provider will deliver services to meet a customer's business outcomes, and define a strategy for how to manage those services. The objectives of the service strategy stage are to define the organisation's strategy and in turn to define services it will offer and identify the customers who will use them. This stage will also help to define how value is created and delivered in providing a service. Opportunities as a service provider need to be identified, but also an understanding of how to exploit those opportunities. Service strategy will help to create a clear service provision model and help the provider organisation understand the capabilities required to deliver its strategy. The service assets used to deliver services will need to be documented and coordinated, and the processes required to deliver the strategy will need to be run.
It is easier to identify the value when making our selection of cars and clothes, as these are products with intrinsic value. But how do we identify the value of a service? Consider what makes you choose one telephone provider over another. The value of a service can be considered to be the level to which that service meets a customer's expectations. Services will contribute value to an organisation only when their value is perceived to be higher than the cost of obtaining the service. From the customer's perspective, value consists of achieving business objectives. The value of a service is created by combining two primary elements, utility and warranty. Utility is the functionality offered by a product or service to meet a particular need, often referred to as what makes a service fit for purpose. In service terms, it represents what is delivered. Warranty is an assurance that a product or service will meet its agreed requirements in terms of its availability, capacity, security and continuity. Warranty is referred to as what makes a service fit for use and represents how the service is delivered. These two elements work together to achieve the desired outcomes upon which the customer and the business base their perceptions of a service.
The value of a service can be considered to be the level to which that service meets a customer's expectations. It is often measured by how much the customer is willing to pay for the service, rather than the cost of the service or any other intrinsic attribute of the service itself. The value of a service is not determined by the provider, but by the person who receives it, because they decide what they will do with the service and what type of return they will achieve by using the service. There is more to value than just the function of the service and its cost. Value needs to be defined in terms of three areas, namely, the business outcomes achieved, the customer's preferences, and the customer's perception of what was delivered. Value is defined not only strictly in terms of the customer's business outcomes, it is also highly dependent on customers' perceptions and preferences. Perceptions are influenced by attributes of a service. present or prior experiences with similar attributes, and relative capability of competitors and other peers. Perceptions are also influenced by the customer's self-image or actual position in the market, such as those of being an innovator, market leader, and risk-taker. The value of a service takes on many forms, and customers have preferences influenced by their perceptions. The preferences and perceptions of customers will affect how they differentiate the value of one offering or service provider over another. Which brings us back to the question of why do we choose one telephone service provider over another when we have a choice of provider?
Although a service provider is not able to decide the value of a service, it is able to influence how the value of the service is perceived by the customers. The starting point for customer perception is the reference value. This could be based on what the customer has heard about the service, or the fact that the customer is currently doing the activity themselves, or some previous experience of that or a similar service. The positive difference of the service is based on the perceived additional benefits and gains provided by the service provider. These differences are based on the additional warranty and utility that the service provider is able to deliver. This is where the service provider is able to influence the customer's perception most. The negative difference of the service is the perception of what the customer would lose by investing in the service. For example, they might perceive some quality issues or hidden costs. The service might not have the full functionality that they would like at the asking price. The service provider can also influence this area by listening to the customer requirements and matching the service features to them. The net difference is the actual perception that the customer has of how much better or worse the service is than the reference value after discounting the negative difference. This is the area that will drive the customer's decision to invest in the service or not. The economic value is the total value that customer perceives the service to deliver. It includes the reference value plus or minus the net difference of the service they receive and is measured by the customer in the ability to meet their desired outcomes. Focusing on business outcomes is critical. Customers do not buy services, they buy the fulfillment of particular needs. This distinction explains the frequent disconnection between IT organizations and the businesses they serve. What the customer values is frequently different from what the IT organization believes it provides.
Before we discuss the processes of service strategy, we need to be clear on a few definitions, in particular assets, resources and capabilities. We discussed these in an earlier section. Let us revisit them briefly here. There is a relationship between service providers and their customers which revolves around the use of assets. That is, assets of both the service provider and the customer. An asset is defined as being any resource or capability. Taking that a step further, a customer asset is defined as being any resource or capability used by a customer to achieve a business outcome. Whilst a service asset is any resource or capability used by a service provider to deliver services to a customer. Many customers use the service they receive from a service provider to build and deliver services or products of their own and then deliver them on to their own customers. In these cases, what the service provider considers to be the customer asset would be considered to be a service asset by their customer. Without customer assets, there is no basis for defining the value of a service. There are two types of asset used by both service providers and customers: resources and capabilities. Resources are readily acquired direct inputs for production, whereas capabilities are typically experience-driven, knowledge-intensive, information-based, and firmly embedded within an organization's people, systems, processes, and technologies. Resources are relatively easy to acquire, whereas capabilities are ordinarily grown within an organization. Capabilities are what differentiate one service provider from another. Two providers may have the same resource pools, but where their respective capabilities differ, so will the value of their proposition in the eyes of each individual customer. This again contributes to the value perception derived by the customer. Capabilities on their own cannot produce value without adequate levels of resource. The service provider needs both the resources under its control and the capabilities to develop, deploy, and coordinate the resources.
Once a service provider understands their position in terms of resource and capabilities and the value proposition that they need to present to their customer, they need to be clear as to which type of service provider they are or want to be. There are three main types of service provider. While most aspects of service management apply equally to all types of service provider, other aspects such as customers, contracts, competition, market spaces, revenue and strategy take on different meanings depending on the specific type. In the following definitions, we will use the example of a service desk in a financial organization. Type 1 is an internal service provider. An internal service provider is embedded within or dedicated to a single business unit. There may be several Type 1 service providers within an organization. Using an example of a service desk in a financial organization, a Type 1 service provider may be a part of the service desk dedicated to one particular high net worth or VIP brand within the group. Type 2 is also an internal service provider, but provides shared IT services to more than one business unit. For example, this may be a shared service desk supporting several brands which share common logging systems. Type 3 is an external service provider that provides IT services to external customers. For example, this may be the outsourced weekend support for all brands.
Within the service strategy stage of the service lifecycle, there are three processes that we need to consider. They are business relationship management, service portfolio management, financial management for IT services. We will discuss these processes in more detail over the remaining lessons of this module.
The business relationship management process enables the business relationship managers, or BRMs, to provide strategic and tactical level links between the service provider and the customer. These links should ensure that the service provider understands the business requirements of the customer and is able to provide services that meet these needs. The key measure of achievement is the level of customer satisfaction. The purpose of the business relationship management process is to firstly establish and maintain a business relationship between the service provider and the customer based on understanding the customer and their business needs. And secondly, to identify customer needs and ensure that the service provider is able to meet these needs as business needs change over time and between circumstances. Business relationship management ensures that the service provider understands these changing needs and assists the business in articulating the value of a service. Business relationship management ensures that customer expectations do not exceed what they are willing to pay for, and that the service provider is able to meet the customer's expectations before agreeing to deliver the service. The objectives of business relationship management are varied and include ensuring that the service provider understands the customer's perspective of service and is in a position to prioritize its services and service assets appropriately. Ensuring high levels of customer satisfaction is a major objective, as this indicates that the service provider is meeting the requirements of the customer. By establishing and maintaining a constructive relationship between the service provider and the customer, the provider will be better positioned to understand the customer and their respective business drivers. This should enable the provider to identify changes to the customer environment as well as identify technology trends that could potentially impact the type, level, or utilization of services provided. By establishing and articulating business requirements for new services or changes to existing services, the provider should be better placed to ensure that the service provider is meeting the business needs of the customer. By working closely with customers, the provider should be able to ensure that services and service levels are able to deliver value. Where necessary, the business relationship manager can mediate in cases where there are conflicting requirements for services from different business units, and establish formal complaints and escalation processes for the customer along the way. The scope for business relationship management is focused on two levels. For Type 1 and Type 2 service providers, the business relationship management process is typically executed between a senior representative from within IT and senior managers, customers, from the business units. Here, the emphasis is on aligning the objectives of the business with the activity of the service provider. In Type 3 service providers, business relationship management is often executed by a separate and dedicated function of business relationship managers or account managers. Each one is dedicated to a customer or group of smaller customers. The emphasis here is on maximizing contract value through customer satisfaction. Business relationship management is dependent upon a number of other service management processes and functions. The mapping of business outcomes and services is performed by service portfolio management. Information about the levels of services agreed and achieved is provided by service level management. Configuration management will provide a mapping of infrastructure, applications, services, service owners and customers, and capacity management provides information regarding utilization levels and the potential impacts of new technologies. There is potential for confusion about the boundaries between these processes. The simplest way to define the scope of the process is to consider that business relationship management focuses on the actual relationship between the service provider and its customers and the levels of customer satisfaction, whereas the other processes focus on the services themselves and the extent to which they meet the stated requirements.
It should be noted that both the service level and business relationship management processes are similar in that they both involve significant interface with customers. Many organizations use a single person or group to execute both processes for this very reason. To be clear on the differences, let us compare the respective purposes of each process. Business relationship management seeks to establish and maintain customer-provider relationship and to identify customer needs and ensure that the provider is able to meet these needs. Service-level management, on the other hand, will respond to those needs by ensuring that SLAs and OLAs are negotiated with customers and ensuring that all underpinning contracts negotiated by supplier management are appropriate. Both have slightly different focuses. Business relationship management focuses at the strategic and tactical levels of provision, focusing on the relationship between the provider and customer, whereas service-level management focuses on the tactical and operational issues, focusing on agreeing the level of service to be delivered and whether the provider was able to meet those agreements. Both are measured from different perspectives. Business relationship management is focused mainly on the level of customer satisfaction and also an improvement in the customer's intention to better use and pay for the service. Service-level management focuses on how well the provider has performed in achieving agreed levels of service, which ultimately leads to customer satisfaction.
The service portfolio represents the commitments and investments made by a service provider across all customers and market spaces. It represents present contractual commitments, new service development, and ongoing service improvement plans initiated by continual service improvement. The portfolio also includes third-party services, which are an integral part of service offerings to customers. The portfolio is made up of three components: the service pipeline, the service catalogue, and the retired services. The service pipeline is a database or structured document listing all services that are under consideration or development but are not yet available to customers. The service pipeline provides a business view of possible future services and is part of the service portfolio that is not normally published to customers. The service catalog is a database or structured document within information about all live IT services, including those available for deployment. The service catalog is the only part of the service portfolio published to customers and is used to support the sale and delivery of IT services. The service catalog includes information about deliverables, prices, contact points, ordering, and request processes. Some services in the service portfolio are phased out or retired. There is a decision to be made by each organization following service review on when to move a service from catalog to retired. Some organizations will do this when the service is no longer available to new customers, even though the service is still being delivered to existing customers. Other organizations will only move the service out of the catalog when it is no longer delivered to any customers. Retired services are maintained in the service portfolio for a number of reasons, including the replacement service might not meet all requirements, and it is important to be able to fall back to the previous service. When defining a new service, service portfolio management might discover that some functionality is available from a retired service. This might result in the service being reinstated as part of a new service. There might be regulatory requirements to maintain archived data that can only be accessed using the previous service, in which case information is exported to a read-only database for future use. The service portfolio is part of the Configuration Management System, or CMS, which is a set of tools and databases that are used to manage an IT service provider's configuration data. It includes information about items such as incidents, problems, known errors, as well as the tools for collecting, storing, managing, updating, and presenting data about all configuration items. In the context of service portfolio management, the Configuration Management System records and controls data about each service and the respective configuration items that make up the services, as well as information on the people and tools that support the services. A number of areas of the Configuration Management System will be used in support of the portfolio. The Configuration Management System will contain a number of configuration management databases, or CMDBs, which are used to store information on the configuration items that are used in providing a service and the relationships with other configuration items. A number of portfolios will also be used. The Application Portfolio, which is a database used to manage applications throughout their lifecycle. The Customer Portfolio is a database used to record all customers of the IT service provider. The Customer Agreement Portfolio is a database used to manage service contracts or agreements between an IT service provider and its customers. The Project Portfolio is a database or structured document used to manage projects that have been chartered. A charter is a document authorizing the project and stating its scope, terms, and references. Underpinning the components of the various portfolios will be the Supplier Contract Management Information System, or SCMIS, providing a single, central repository of information for the management of all suppliers and contracts.
Whilst a service portfolio describes a provider's services in terms of business value, it articulates business needs and the provider's response to those needs. The purpose of service portfolio management is to ensure that the service provider has the right mix of services to balance the investment in IT with the ability to meet business outcomes. It tracks the investment in services throughout their life cycle and works with other service management processes to ensure that the appropriate returns are being achieved. The objectives of service portfolio management are to provide a process and mechanisms to enable an organisation to investigate and decide on which services to provide, based on an analysis of the potential return and acceptable level of risk. A definitive portfolio of services needs to be provided and maintained, articulating the business needs each service meets and the business outcomes that it supports. The process needs to provide a mechanism for the organisation to evaluate how services enable it to achieve its strategy and to respond to changes in its internal or external environments. Service portfolio management needs to control which services are offered, under what conditions, and at what level of investment. The investment in services needs to be tracked throughout their life cycle, thereby enabling an organisation to evaluate its strategy as well as its ability to execute against that strategy. Finally, the process should ensure that an analysis should be performed to determine which services are no longer viable and when they should be retired. The scope of service portfolio management is all services a service provider plans to deliver, those currently delivered and those that have been withdrawn from service. The primary concern of service portfolio management is whether the service provider is able to generate value from the services. Service portfolio management evaluates the value of services throughout their life cycles and must be able to compare what newer services have offered over the retired services they have replaced.
Risk is defined as uncertainty of outcome, whether positive opportunity or negative threat. Most of the time we think of risk in negative terms as an event or occurrence that may happen, or something that could happen. And with the event, there are consequences and impacts that are negative in terms of additional cost or time, or the event impacts on the quality of a service. It is worth keeping an open mind on risk. If there is potentially a delay in delivering a service, that in turn may present improvement opportunities. For example, on a service desk reskilling project, the delay may allow additional training to take place for service desk staff, resulting in more effective analysts. It is important to identify risks and then manage those risks through a visible, repeatable, and consistently applied framework. The defined framework should include all aspects of risk analysis and management that should be applied. Aspects for inclusion could be, for example, recommended scales for analysing risk impact and probability and standard risk categories for potential risk escalation. Once the risk has been identified, it needs to be analysed in line with the guidelines of the risk framework. The analysis will include evaluating the impact of the risk to the service in line with any tolerances set, identifying suitable responses or countermeasures to the risk, as well as selecting the best people to own the risk and the responsibility for activating any responses. With the risks assessed and their respective action plans documented, the risk management plan must be reviewed regularly to ensure that appropriate actions have been taken, have been evaluated for effectiveness, and are performing as expected. Risk management is ongoing throughout the service lifecycle. The risk analysis and management activities are likely to be completed several times. The level of risk a service provider faces will be captured in the business case and therefore could be a major influence as to whether a service should be offered in the first place.
Financial management is a complex process that all organisations use as a basis for conducting business. It is usually owned by a senior executive and managed by a financial management function. The IT organisation, along with all other departments, is involved in the organisation's financial management process. Within the ITIL life cycle, it is recognised that these two layers of financial management exist within most organisations, and refers to financial management as a general process used by the organisation, as well as to financial management as it is applied by an IT service provider. Financial management for IT services is the process responsible for managing an IT service provider's budgeting, accounting, and charging requirements. It is also the process that is used to quantify the value that IT services contribute to the business. The purpose of financial management for IT services is to secure the appropriate level of funding to design, develop and deliver services that meet the strategy of the organisation. At the same time, financial management for IT services is a gatekeeper that ensures that the service provider does not commit to services that they are not able to provide. Financial management for IT services identifies the balance between the cost and quality of service, and maintains the balance of supply and demand between the service provider and their customers. There are many objectives for the financial management for IT services process. These include defining and maintaining a framework to identify, manage and communicate the cost of providing services, to ensure that financial impact of new or changed strategies on the service provider are fully evaluated. These service changes will require funding to be secured to enable the change to be provisioned. Financial management for IT services will be responsible for securing that funding. The process is also responsible for facilitating good stewardship of service and customer assets to ensure the organisation meets its objectives. The relationship between expenses and income needs to be understood, and the process should ensure that the two are balanced according to the organisation's financial policies. All expenditure on service provision needs to be managed and reported on behalf of the organisation's stakeholders, as well as all financial policies and practices in the provision of services being correctly executed. All money spent on the creation, delivery and support of services will need to be accounted for. Forecasting the financial requirements for the organisation to be able to meet its service commitments to its customers and compliance with regulatory and legislative requirements. Where appropriate, defining a framework to recover the costs of service provision from the customer. Financial management is normally a well-established and well-understood part of any organisation, with professional accountants managing dedicated finance departments. In an IT context, financial management is often a separate function, but with some form of functional reporting between the two areas. Financial management for IT services is a specialised area that requires an understanding of the world of finance and business as well as the world of technology. Financial management for IT services consists of three main processes. Budgeting, the process of predicting and controlling the income and expenditure of money within the organisation. It consists of a periodic negotiation cycle to set budgets, usually annually, and the monthly monitoring of the current budgets. Accounting, the process that enables the IT organisation to account fully for the way its money is spent, particularly the ability to identify costs by customer, by service, and by activity. It usually involves accounting systems and should be overseen by someone trained in accounting practices. Finally, charging, the process required to bill customers for the services supplied to them.
As financial management for IT services is tasked with acting as a gatekeeper to ensure that the provider does not commit to offering services that they cannot supply for commercial reasons. Service economics relate to the balance between the cost of providing services, the value of the outcomes achieved, and the returns that the services enable the service provider to achieve. The dynamics of service economics for external or Type 3 service providers are different from those for internal or Types 1 or 2 service providers. This is because the returns of internal service providers are mainly measured by their internal customers and do not accrue directly to the service provider. The Type 3 service provider delivers a service to an external customer for payment. The service provider calculates the total investment required to deliver that service and measures it against the total revenue obtained from delivering the service. The success of the service provider is measured by its return on investment, ROI. Return on investment, or ROI, is a concept for quantifying the value of an investment, and the calculation is normally performed by financial management. Securing funds for a service, therefore, is closely linked to demonstrating how service management can help achieve or support specific business imperatives. For this, those providing the funding will be looking for a positive return on investment. However, service management is often an investment that companies must make in advance of any return. The challenge for those seeking funding for ITIL projects is identifying a specific business imperative that is dependent upon service management. A key tool in making that decision as to whether to invest in a service or not is the business case. A business case is a decision support and planning tool that projects the likely consequences of a business action. Financial analysis is often at the center of a good business case. A business case should contain sufficient information at the right level of detail to enable a decision to be made as to whether a specific service management investment is viable and justified. Each business case should contain an introduction, which is where the business objectives addressed by the service will be presented. The methods and assumptions will define the organizational context that is being used to define costs and benefits and the boundaries of the business case, such as time period, and which suppliers could be utilized as examples. The business impacts will reflect the financial and non-financial results anticipated for the service or service management initiative. Non-financial results can also be expressed in financial terms. An example might be where an initiative brings about an increase in staff morale, which in turn result in lower staff turnover, lower absenteeism, and, as a result, less expenditure on hiring and training. The risks and contingencies should identify the major potential risks faced and their likelihood of occurring, along with their projected impacts and suggested solutions to mitigate those impacts. Every business case should present the options and their respective business impacts, but also a recommendation as to the best course of action: invest or reject.
Selecting and adopting the best practice as recommended by service strategy stage of the life cycle will assist organizations in delivering significant benefits. Adopting and implementing standard and consistent approaches for service strategy will support the ability to link activities performed by the service provider to outcomes that are critical to internal or external customers. As a result, the service provider will be seen to be contributing to the value and not just the costs of the organization. Enable the service provider to have a clear understanding of what types and levels of service will make its customers successful, and then organize themselves optimally to deliver and support those services. Enable the service provider to respond quickly and effectively to changes in the business environment, ensuring increased competitive advantage over time. Support the creation and maintenance of a portfolio of services that will enable the business to achieve positive return on its investment in services. Facilitate functional and transparent communication between the customer and the service provider, so that both have a consistent understanding of what is required and how it will be delivered. Provide the means for the service provider to organize themselves, so that it can provide services in an efficient and effective manner. This completes the lessons within this module. You should take the opportunity to reflect back against the module objectives. Consider whether these objectives have been met and whether you need to review any of the lessons. When you are comfortable with having completed the module learning, you can progress to the next module.